For no apparent reason, companies loved making putty and clay games on the SNES. There are a handful of games with this theme, like Claymates and Clay Fighter, but none of them were as bold as to include Super in the title as Super Putty. Super Putty is a platformer with that kind of retro game absurdity that defined the era. It's completely random, and I would bet my $10 copy that it is nothing at all like what you're expecting. It was first released on the Amiga under the name Putty, and they basically just ported it over to the SNES and slapped Super in front of the title. It's time to see what we can squeeze out of Super Putty on the Super Nintendo and determine if it's a play or nay. Okay, I have to start with the story. I have to. Listen to this. There's an evil wizard named Dazzle-Daze who is getting into the gum-making business. He wants to capture blue putty creatures from their home planet of Putty Moon to use as a special ingredient in the gum. There are also robots from a nearby planet called Zid who try and help the putty creatures, but he freezes them in blocks of ice to stop them from interfering. They're called robots, but you can't fool me. These things are hamburgers. You somehow get stuck on Earth and have to try to free the robots from captivation, and let me tell you, Earth is somehow even more of a nightmare in this game than in real life. Who in the hell thought of this story? I'll give them some points for creativity, but I can't say I felt very gripped by the plot. You play as the most generic hero of all time. Putty, I guess is his name. He's a blue ball with eyes. Yep. He can jump or stretch to get around and punch, explode, or absorb enemies to kill them. You can even absorb some special abilities from some enemies in Kirby style, which sounds way more awesome than it actually is. The movement controls are kind of delayed and clunky and are always either too fast or too slow. You can get around really quickly by stretching, but you never have more than 1 inch of free space before you run into enemies. Jumping is slower, but is about the only safe option most of the time. Punching has a tiny reach and absolutely sucks. It barely kills anything and does actually nothing to the majority of enemies. You can only punch to the left or right, so if there are bad guys above or below you, you're just out of luck. You can mash the X button and puff yourself up, which makes Putty explode. This essentially kills everything on screen but rips a big chunk out of your health. Pliability? This is a great way to clear the screen, but the health loss part makes it something you can only use rarely. The absorbing mechanic feels clumsy and terrible. You hold down to turn into a puddle and can absorb some smaller enemies and items. You're invincible while in puddle form, which is nice, but you can't move and it has a small delay going in and out of it, so it's slow and awkward to use like everything else. Your main goal on each level is to find the Zid robots, absorb them, and return them to a rescue point. You can see how many of these robots you need to save on each level, and you normally can only carry one at a time. On the earlier levels they're frozen in blocks of ice, but later on they just randomly walk and jump around like they don't even want to be rescued. Sometimes they're scattered throughout the stage, but in the later levels they're typically huddled together at the very top. Get used to going up and down each level like 4 times because that's all you're going to be doing. If you absorb certain types of enemies, you can use their powers, which is, again, slow and clunky. You have this annoying little transforming animation that plays every single time you use an ability. There are 5 or 6 different worlds with a few stages each. Each world is colorful, but the graphics are just bad and look like they belong on the NES. All the levels do have a lot going on. Tons of traps, enemies, robots to save, rescue points, elevators, health pickups, you name it. They start out a little difficult and get downright ridiculous. To make everything a million times worse, there is no continue option or password system, so if you want to drag yourself through the brutality of the later levels, you're going to have to keep beating the earlier ones again and again and again and again. At the start of each stage, it shows you the same instructions about rescuing the robots, like you haven't figured it out 10 stages in. They also list out a boss for the level and some bonus enemies that give you extra points if you manage to kill them. It's like they just made the largest enemies on each stage the boss because they aren't actual bosses and typically aren't even the hardest things to deal with. One thing I will give them credit for is the huge variety of enemies. Each stage might have 5 or 6 different types of enemies, and different stages inside of a world usually even have unique ones. However, you won't have any time to appreciate the design because you'll be trying to keep yourself from having a stroke while avoiding them. You're given absolutely no clue how to kill each enemy, and have to use trial and error until you figure it out. Some really basic enemies will die from punching, but sometimes they won't, and just drop down to a floor underneath you. Sometimes you can only kill a monster by absorbing it, but you'll take damage from getting close enough to even do that. Other times you have to jump on an enemy or use a special ability, or even your self-harming explosion. Most enemies respawn in like 15 seconds, which is infuriating. You have to go up and down each stage several times and end up killing the same enemies 10 times each. You either have to continuously kill the same enemies or try to miraculously make it past them, but you better decide fast because each level also has a timer, like the game wasn't hard enough already. Sometimes enemies will even spawn indefinitely, and you'll come back with a newly rescued robot and find like 20 guys running around. There are tons of enemies with guns and cannons, and every level has bullets and rockets flying freaking everywhere. To make things even worse, if you touch an enemy, you can take like 10 hits in a second and lose half your life bar from the slightest misstep. God, I'm getting stressed out again just explaining it. Lots of the time, these quirky little obscure titles have surprisingly great soundtracks that manage to pull them up from the depths of mediocrity, but the sound design in this game is honestly pathetic. Listen to the beginning of the main theme. The stages have some of the most uninspired and generic music I've ever heard, and are so bland my brain automatically tuned them all out. Most enemy sounds are loud and annoying, and are spammed all throughout each level. To their credit, some of them are pretty funny, but the ratio of bad to good isn't. For some reason, half of the sounds you make as Putty are burps and pops and farts, and they don't fit in with anything or make any sense. Oh man, I totally forgot to mention one last shining star of the game. There's this godforsaken cat who is apparently named Dweezil and is your arch nemesis. He shows up on some levels as an actual enemy, but will also occasionally rip through the screen to yell some infuriating insult at you when you miss a bonus.
You're bad.
Who thought this was a good idea? If you get a game over, you get this wonderful close-up of his face and he taunts you even further.
You're bad.
Look at it. I seriously cannot picture a more aggravating thing to see when you die. I hadn't seen a second of gameplay from Super Putty and went into it with as much childlike eagerness as I could muster. I tried to play it strategically and I was hoping it would show me a fun Friday night, but man, I was wrong. This game just flat out reeks of mediocrity. It doesn't offer anything you can't find in a million other way more fun games, and the difficulty and lack of any sort of continue or password system makes it more and more frustrating the further you get into it. The graphics are colorful and decently cute, but were outdated even at release. The music is dull and has no heart, and the controls are clunky and frustrating. Unless you hold some mysterious nostalgia for this game, or just really like these kinds of brutally difficult old-school platformers, avoid Super Putty and choose something else. Thank you for checking out my video! If you liked what you saw, please like, subscribe, and click the bell to see when I post new videos. I'll be reviewing tons of older games to see how they've held up over the years and if they're still worth playing these days. Some games I'll be covering in upcoming episodes are Goof Troop, Secret of Evermore, Super Ninja Boy, The Flintstones, Treasure of the Sierra Madrock, and Illusion of Gaia. Your support for these videos goes a long way in their creation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch. That's all the time I've got for today. My name's Ben Madsen, and I'll see you on the next episode of Play or Nay.